Hopefully everybody can see those without any trouble. And I am going to just talk about what I have. Sorry? Everything okay? Yeah. Just talk about what I've been going through, what I've experienced over the past 15 years in trying to change my approach to supporting people who are living with dementia. Let me just put this into the slideshow. And I have never been to Malaysia. I would love to visit one day, but so I do not know a lot about Malaysia in person. I don't know much about the culture or the systems of care, but I've traveled the world quite a bit. I've spoken in 24 countries in most of the continents of the world. And there are many similarities as far as dementia, as far as how people experience dementia, how care systems work. So I'm hoping that if I explain my experiences and what I have done, that this will be helpful. Much of this will hopefully be helpful in your work as well. So I'm talking about changing the culture of care, and I'm talking about what I would call reframing dementia. And so what do I mean when I say that? Well, I'm not talking about anything that's new that hasn't existed before. I'm certainly not saying that we deny that there is very real brain disease and brain injury in people with dementia. But what I mean by reframing is looking at the condition through different eyes. The French novelist Marcel Proust once wrote that the only true voyage of discovery is not to visit strange lands, but to possess other eyes, to behold the universe through the eyes of another or of 100 others. So it's really about taking a very old disease and just looking at it differently and trying to use our creativity to say, what else can we see besides some of the things that have been taught to us as far as the narrow views of brain structures and rules and approaches to dementia. My work emphasizes the importance of learning from people living with the condition and appreciating their perspective. I will certainly give a hat off to many of the people living with dementia around the world who are now also writing, speaking, advocating, and teaching me a lot about their experiences as they're able. And in doing all this, I do believe we can find new solutions for living better. And also the insights I have gained have challenged many long-held views about dementia and supporting people who live with the diagnosis. I'm seeing a thing about hands going up. So Cecilia, if you could moderate, and if there's anything I need to stop for, just go ahead and let me know, please. And thank you all for allowing me to give this in English. It is the only language I can give a talk like this in, so I appreciate your indulgence. And if you want me to slow down, please say so. In this session, I will certainly share some information that's agreed upon by many people who are specialists in dementia, but I'm going to share many things that diverge or challenge some of the conventional wisdom of the more traditional approaches. And that is how I have found a different path, because instead of trying to do the same thing over and over again, I've not seen much change in the way we support people with dementia, the way we use medications, the way people live. And so it seemed important to me to try to find some things that maybe challenge what we have often taken as truth about dementia. But where I do that, I will certainly let you know, and I will try to support my views with either, if not evidence that's generated, certainly some examples that I hope will be compelling for you. So a bit about me, if you don't know me, I started many years ago in a private practice in internal medicine as a general practitioner. I thought that was what I was going to do for the rest of my career, but I only did it for about 7 years. And I was lured into working in residential care and became a geriatrician and very much enjoyed that. And then after about 7 years of that, I learned about some of the movements in the US to transform residential care environments. Movements like the Eden Alternative, the Greenhouse Project, the Pioneer Network, and became very involved with all those and remain involved with all those organizations. And I really was never happy with the use of antipsychotic drugs. They never did what I wanted them to do. And I worried that we were often sedating people and not really meeting their needs as much as ours. And so I thought maybe I can apply some of the same transformational concepts I'd learned about to looking at dementia. And actually, when I started really trying to push a new idea, I wrote a paper about this, which I sent into the Journal of the American Geriatric Society. This would have been back around 2006, 2007. And they liked the paper very much, but it was long and it was not based on any primary research. And so ultimately they decided not to publish it. And I took it to one of my mentors at the University of Rochester, Dr. William Hall, and said, what should I do with a paper like this? And he said, well, it's hard to publish things like this that are not backed by research, so why don't you write a book? And so that's what the next 3 years of my life, when I wasn't practicing, were consumed with, was trying to figure out how to write a book, which is what Dementia Beyond Drugs became. But it was very much figuring it out as I went along, because I knew that I wasn't happy with the status quo, but I had to figure out what to do differently and how to explain that clearly to other people. But when that book came out and when more press came out about the dangers of antipsychotic drugs in the US, it got people calling me and asking me to speak and to give educational seminars. And so I left the practice of medicine. And for the past better part of 15 years, I've been traveling and giving education and working with other people and consulting and finding ways to refine my ideas. So I'll give you sort of the state of where I am at now in 2023, and who knows where we'll go after this. I'm just going to keep my clock here so I don't take too long and we have some time for discussion. So a couple of medical things, and the next couple of slides will only have some medical things, and then I'm going to depart from what we know. But I want to make sure, just because we have 300 people on the call, you've filled up the Zoom boxes, and just to make sure we are on the same page, dementia is a syndrome. It's not a single disease, but it's a collection of symptoms that affect the brain that have over 100 causes. And the brain changes that we identify as Alzheimer's disease are seen most commonly. There are problems with several types of thinking. It's not only about memory. And not only do people have some difficulty with their thinking, but to call it dementia, generally they are permanent and severe enough to affect people's daily life. In many people, if not most, with dementia, it is progressive over time, and death often occurs due to complications of the dementia. And there's currently no way to cure, reverse, or stop the progression of dementia. We do have a couple of new drugs in the US. They are very controversial. I personally do not think that their evidence is very strong compared to the very real risks and costs of the medication. But there are many things that we can do today to live more fully with the diagnosis and to support people to live more fully. And that's the focus of my talk. I am not a drug researcher, so my job is to try to help people to support people better and for people to live better, since I'm not going to invent the next pill. In my opinion, there are some things we still don't know about dementia. I say here the causes of Alzheimer's because I'm not convinced that Alzheimer's is a disease. We're already talking about some that are more predominant with the tau compound versus amyloid. I'm not sure it really is a disease, or perhaps the brain changes are a final common pathway to many things that can happen throughout your life. I'm not convinced that amyloid is the way to go. Amyloid cause versus effect is still very much a question in my mind. And I am skeptical as to whether reducing amyloid is going to significantly affect the course of the illness. I don't think we understand well how mild cognitive impairment is related to dementia. When the term first came out, it was considered a pre-Alzheimer's. They would progress, but now we've seen over time that many people do not progress to dementia during their life, and some people's cognitive tests actually go back to normal. So that makes early interventions difficult to study, because it's hard to know who you are preventing from progressing and not. And really more of a large scale question is, why is so much of a percentage of our money spent on those pills when we spend so little on addressing the many socioeconomic and educational deficits and risk factors that could really impact the occurrence of dementia in our aging society? But the result of all these questions and all this medical information is that the brain is an incredibly complex organ. Many people estimate that there are as many as 100 trillion nerve connections in a fully formed brain. And on top of that, people are complex and unique too. Everybody on this call could have the same stage of the same kind of dementia, and yet we would all experience it differently. And based on our histories, our strengths, our personalities, our abilities, we would all express those changes very much differently too. So nothing I told you about the medical information tells us about an individual person or about their strengths. And I don't believe any of the above helps us to help people to live better today. And that is, as I said, our primary role if we're not doing drug research. But furthermore, if we look at dementia too narrowly through purely a disease-based lens, I think that there could be many negative effects on people who live with the diagnosis. We know what the biomedical model of dementia looks like. We talk about the microscopic changes, plaques and tangles. We see the graphics of people whose brains are disappearing. We see atrophy on X-rays. We have staging systems that show a very steady decline over time from normal health toward severe disability and death. Not to say that any of these are not true, but that there's an intense focus merely on the disease, on what's wrong, on what's missing, on what's going away. And it's a very one-sided view that leads us down a different road. And when we only see dementia through this narrow lens, there can be many harmful effects on the people living with the diagnosis. Some of them are that there are many myths and stigmas around dementia. And when you look at dementia strictly through disease and deficit and decline, that actually magnifies those myths and stigmas in the eyes of society. That people's beliefs about people being incapable and not being able to live well are magnified by a view that only looks at disease and deficits. We tend to lump people together and talk about dementia care, and it's always somewhat curious to me that everybody talks about that quote that is attributed to Tom Kipwood, that if you've met one person with dementia, you've only met one person with dementia. And yet we can say that, and in the same breath, we can homogenize people and talk about dementia care and dementia housing and dementia activities as if everybody is going to be the same way. I think when you see this purely as disease, our idea of creating well-being for people is in the realm of medications, because that's how you treat diseases. I believe we're very quick to disempower and underestimate people's abilities because of this view. And we also have this framework of BPSD, which stands for behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. And this is a framework which is the dominant framework for viewing dementia and viewing people's words and actions who are living with dementia. And I'm going to spend some time challenging this pretty firmly today, because I think that in order to liberate ourselves to some different successful ideas, we have to separate ourselves from this idea. And it's maybe a slight difference, some of you might think, but I'm going to explain that. And I'm going to show you how that difference can lead to some very large differences in outcomes. I'm not a person who focuses on things like cognitive scores and staging systems. I understand that for research and for tracking people, they're somewhat useful, but they are very reductionistic. They tend to reduce people to a number, and they are very, they don't measure everything that a person is. Is a person with dementia just their cognitive score? I would ask all of you, are you just your school grade average, or is there more to you than that? I do think they tend to pigeonhole and stereotype people, and they do not recognize many intact strengths and characteristics which are not measured with standardized testing. As a result, I think people are underestimated, and they can lead to unhelpful practices like grouping people for living or for activities. And once again, I would raise the question, would you only want to be put to live with other people whose grades were the same as yours at university? Or would you only want to be offered activities with those people? And do you think that because you had the same grade scores, that you would all like doing the same things? We make these assumptions based on these very reductionistic scales. There are many other myths and stereotypes. That people with dementia cannot make decisions. People with dementia, in my view, are making decisions every day. Even when they say no or push something away from them, they are giving you a decision. People are learning all the time. They learn implicitly, they learn explicitly through repetition, and they also learn with very durable emotional memories, which sometimes are more powerful than factual memories, but nevertheless will govern people's understanding of the world and their behavior. People with dementia become like children again. I don't believe people with dementia are like children. They lose abilities. But a person who's lived for 60, 70, 80 years, who's been educated, who perhaps has been married, who has had a career, or who has perhaps had physical intimacy, who has experienced loss and grief, these people will never view the world like a child does. And I think it's, once again, the wrong practice to treat people as if they are a stage of childhood or infancy. And the idea that people with dementia are fading away. Their ability to connect and communicate may change, but the people are very much there. And I think that is important for us to recognize as well. Stephen Sabat gave a webinar I attended several years ago for Dementia Alliance International, and his research showed that there are many traits that are often preserved into advanced dementia. such as experiencing pride and maintaining dignity. And the converse, you can also experience shame and embarrassment if not supported properly. Feeling and showing concern for others around you who are obviously distressed. Communicating feelings, sometimes with assistance from a facilitator. Maintaining self-esteem as well as possible, and manifesting spiritual awareness. Christine Bryden, one of the first international advocates living with dementia, who I have had a chance to meet on a few occasions, has now been living with the diagnosis of dementia for 27 years. And she certainly has had some decline in some of her abilities, but she is a spiritual person. She is a religious person. And she says that as her dementia progresses, she actually sees herself becoming more of a spiritual being. So she sees herself as growing in that one aspect of life. In addition to what Dr. Sabat said, I would add there are many other things that people with significant change can do. People do learn new information. People can access memories and language with the proper stimuli, perhaps music or art, etc. Many people can read a book to a child or sing or play music, even though they can't remember names. It's amazing how people can remember lyrics when they can't remember other names and orient themselves to time. People can create art. People with significant dementia, research has shown, can teach a recipe, often almost as well as people without dementia. And people like Ann Basting in the US with her Time Slips program show the incredible power of people to use narrative to create stories around the photo that they are shown and engage with each other in creative storytelling, even though they may have significant cognitive change. And I would offer there are many other things that people with dementia can do. They can teach the rest of us what it's like to have dementia. They can give input into their care plans. They can advise on dementia education programs. And there are many people who feel that major conferences on dementia should not take place without the active participation of people living with the diagnosis. And I think that's a very good challenge for people putting on conferences. They can give input into design and renovations. And going down a couple of bullets there, my friend Agnes Houston, who's been living with Alzheimer's for about a decade in Scotland, actually volunteers to survey residential care homes as a person with dementia to help them understand how their lighting, how their sound, how their layout is or is not conducive to enabling people with dementia. People with dementia can certainly engage in peer conversations, and many groups like Dementia Alliance International have wonderful support groups, peer-led support groups. People can participate in volunteerism. And once again, instead of saying you're diagnosed with dementia, you have to go home and let us take care of you. Alzheimer's Western Australia started a program many years ago where when people in the community were diagnosed, they would go out and get them connected with a volunteer opportunity. So they continued to find meaningful work and engagement and not just sit home and fade away because of this label. So let's talk about this whole BPSD thing, and I'm going to reframe behaviors. This is an actual ad for Thorazine, one of the first generation antipsychotics that came from many years ago, probably about 60 years ago in the United States. And the words there say, tyrant in the house, Thorazine can control the agitated, belligerent, senile. Now, there are some words there that we don't use anymore, and we don't use Thorazine much anymore. But I would argue that much of the mindset behind this has not really changed very much at all. So let's challenge that a bit. And I'm going to start by having you look at ourselves and some of the things that we experience. And I'll ask you a somewhat provocative question. And that is, do we actually hold people with dementia to a higher standard emotionally than we hold ourselves? So let's look at this chart. What do you and I do? We walk every day. We may enter or exit buildings. We may explore our environment. We may get our Apple Watches or our Fitbits and do our steps. Or we might just get bored and leave. But when people with dementia do those exact same things, it gets labeled wandering, eloping, or exit seeking. We can get restless when forced into other people's rhythms, whereas people with dementia are labeled with sundowning. I have both caused people without dementia to have something very similar to sundowning when I give an 8-hour seminar, because it's hard for people to attend to something like that without a lot of moving around and without a lot of breaks. And I also conversely have seen organizations, including one of the villages I work with up here in Canada, eliminate sundowning by changing their operations. And we can talk about that later. We often go to stores, big stores, and we shop in bulk. We certainly saw people shopping in bulk when the pandemic first hit. But if people with dementia pick up more things than one at a time, we label them as people who are hoarding. I think that you and I can get angry, sad, anxious, or frustrated. These are called normal human emotions. But as soon as you have the label with dementia, all of a sudden these are labeled as challenging or responsive behaviors. And finally, you and I don't like being locked up, bossed around, or touched by strangers. And yet, when a person with dementia responds to those, they are labeled resistive, agitated, or aggressive. So the problem with this label is that it says that these are symptoms of dementia. To me, the implication of that is that the brain disease is causing people to do what they do or say what they say. And when you say that it's the brain disease is the root cause, you're ignoring a host of other contexts, which may be relational, environmental, or historical contexts. It tends to pathologize normal expressions, as I just talked about on the last slide. It can create a slippery slope to drug use. And I believe that the BPSD framework is actually the biggest barrier to eliminating inappropriate antipsychotic use, because if you truly believe that the brain disease is at the root of this, eventually you're going to use a pill. That's going to be your default, because how else do you treat disease except through medication? And even though we have those recommendations to try non-pharmacologic approaches first, it can take some work sometimes to find solutions. And if you really believe these are symptoms of brain disease, people do not put forth the effort that they need to truly brainstorm solutions before they just go back to medication. It doesn't explain why at any given time in the United States, for example, there are 200 residential care homes that use 0 antipsychotics, and there are hundreds more who use 3% or less. If this really is a symptom of an incurable disease, how do we explain the wide variety in whether these drugs are used or not? I believe that it misapplies psychiatric labels, such as psychosis, delusions, and hallucinations. I think the things we label that in dementia are very much a different phenomenon, and they are very much biochemically different things going on in the brain than what you see in a person with functional psychosis like schizophrenia. And the danger of using those labels too liberally is that they lead you down the road to using antipsychotic drugs. As many as 20 years ago, the noted researcher, Dr. Yiska Cohen-Mansfield, wrote a paper in which she said that we should abandon the word psychosis when talking about dementia, because what's going on within the brain is not the same thing as what we see in people with schizophrenia. And dopamine blockage doesn't really make sense like it does in somebody who has a congenital or a condition that has upregulated dopamine activity. And it's led to inappropriate drug approvals in many countries. And I used to hold the United States as being one of the good countries that never approved an antipsychotic for dementia. I can't do that anymore because they have approved the drug as of a month ago. The drug brand name is Rexulti. And the truth is that that drug is no more effective or no safer than any of the drugs they rejected 15, 20 years ago. The difference is it was politically a friendlier climate to get a drug through the Food and Drug Administration, and that's why it's approved. But I don't think it's one bit better than any other brand we use. So this is where I start to split hairs a little bit and talk about this fine distinction I'm making. First of all, the brain changes are very real. The question is this the root cause of the person's action? We know that people can experience difficulties with retrieving information or memories. We know that verbal communication can be affected. We know that people's coping skills and their social filters can be affected. And we know that executive function, planning, and problem-solving skills can also be affected. So as a result, the changes of dementia can modify how a person responds in a given situation. But that's different from saying that brain disease is the root cause. I have a friend, Barney Nelson, who lives with Lewy body dementia. And he talks about the Lewy body as putting kerosene on a fire. In other words, if there's something that is bothering him, the Lewy body dementia can make it even more bothersome and harder to control. So the Lewy body dementia definitely has an effect, but it didn't cause it in the first place. And that's the big difference. So I'll just give you a very simplistic example. I just did this today in my training session, and I often do this in classes just to make people uncomfortable. I'll have a class of people and I'll say, why don't we try a fun activity? I'm just going to pair you up with whoever's sitting next to you. They're often coworkers. And I'd like the two of you, we'll have the two of you go away to a shower room, and your partner can strip you naked and give you a shower. And of course, people get very nervous, and nobody wants to do that. And if I were offered to offer that to people voluntarily. It would be a very rare person who would want to do that. And I think it's important to just stop there and think about that for a moment. In a classroom situation with people you work with and know very well, you still are not willing to be undressed and given a shower by another person. And yet we expect people with dementia to do this over and over again in residential care, something that we would not volunteer to do once with somebody we know well. And we're often asking people to do it with rotating staff or agency staff or people they don't recognize coming in and taking off their clothes and doing this. So if a person doesn't enjoy a shower, that's not their problem, because we're asking them to do something we do not want to do. So it is really up to us to make that an experience that they can tolerate. That's not a behavior problem. We're asking people to do something that we would not do ourselves. So what do I think is going on? What do people's words and actions mean to me as far as root causes? Well, I put them in 7 categories. The biggest one may be that there are unmet needs that are being expressed. And I'm also going to include with that what I call challenges to well-being. And I'm going to introduce that framework shortly. There can be sensory challenges. And one thing Agnes Houston talks about in her education sessions is what happens to the 5 senses with dementia. Dementia can affect your taste, your sight, your hearing, your sense of smell, and your sense of touch. And it's important to know how those are changing in individuals. It can be a different communication pathway when you can't say things the way you used to. It can simply be an expression of agency, trying to exert some kind of power or control over a situation that feels like it's out of your control. It could simply be a different way of interpreting or problem solving. And I wrote a chapter for a book several years ago where I explained the concept of delusions using the American game show Wheel of Fortune, where people are given a few letters and they have to solve a word or a phrase. And I think it's very similar because people with dementia are missing information and their brains are very active. They're trying to figure out the world, but they don't have all the information. So their interpretation may sound silly to us. It may sound delusional, but it's really them making their best guess without all the information. And the people that are trying to solve a puzzle like Wheel of Fortune may also guess the wrong word, but they don't guess the wrong word because they're delusional. And giving contestants on the show an antipsychotic doesn't help them solve the word puzzle. It could be a response to physical aspects of the environment or relational, interpersonal aspects of the environment. And as we showed earlier, it could be a perfectly normal reaction considering the circumstances. Now, the important thing about these 7 categories is there will never be a pill that will successfully treat any of these needs. And there will never be a non-pharmacological intervention either. Now, that may sound a little confusing, but I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because I think we really get hung up on why our non-pharmacological approaches don't work. And I'd like to try and explain that to you in just a moment. But here are a few more challenging examples. Trying to exit a living area is not abnormal. I was on the living area where these people with dementia were living today at this residential care home. And when it was done, I went out the door. The door is alarmed. I pushed the keypad and I walked out. For me, to leave a building is never abnormal. I do it every single day. What's really abnormal is locking somebody in who's not a criminal and not letting them leave. So once again, if someone's upset because they want to leave and the door's locked, that's not their fault. That's our fault because we haven't found a way to give them more freedom. Resisting being undressed by someone you don't recognize is not abnormal. What would anyone else do if someone came up to you and started removing your clothes? Wanting to do things your own way, at your pace, and on your terms is not abnormal. And being angry if you've expressed a concern to someone else and they either correct you, distract you, redirect you, or lie to you is not abnormal. These are techniques we're taught to do when people are upset about something. But imagine expressing a concern to your coworker or your supervisor and having them do one of those things to you. Do you feel like that would really help you and your concern? So I'm going to take a break with this, and I think I have to stop sharing and then start again so I can get the other thing up. When I was talking about challenging the BPSD concept, I got this idea based on the whole idea about wandering, to take a very famous old European folk song and do sort of a funny video. So I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to switch my screens here so that I can put the YouTube video up. And we'll just take a sort of a lighthearted moment here to see this video. And this, once again, maybe explains things better in 2 minutes than I did in the last 10 minutes. So let me just expand this and we'll play the video for you. And I hope you'll be able to, I don't know if I put the sound sharing on, so I'm going to start this. And Cecilia, let me know if you don't hear the sound, okay? Hi, everybody. This is Al Power with my colleague Heather Luth. We're at Schlegel Villages in Ontario, Canada. Okay, sound okay or not?
All good, Dr. Allen.
Oh, you're gonna put it up? Okay. Yeah,
yes,
I forgot.
Yes.
When you share the screen, you have to hit a little.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, good. Yeah, why don't you do that for me then, Cecilia? Thank you so much.
Dr. Allen, you may share it because we could hear you loud and clear.
Oh, you did it.
Yes,
did it.
yes.
I'm sorry. So you want me to do it? Got it. Okay. My mistake. I thought you were going to run it from yours. Okay, let me just put it back up again. Share screen, back again. Maximize, go back to the beginning. Okay, here we go. Hi, everybody. This is Al Power with my colleague Heather Luth. We're at Schlegel Villages in Ontario, Canada. This year for WRAD 19, we decided to bring you the great old German folk song, The Happy Wanderer, which is sung by millions of people in many different languages. But we've decided to try to reimagine what would happen if the song were sung by a person living with a diagnosis of dementia and observed by maybe a medically oriented person who saw their words and actions as behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. So I'm going to sing the actual lyrics to a couple verses, and Heather is going to observe me and tell me what she thinks about my words through that lens. I love to go wandering.
Sorry, Dr. Allen, the video is frozen. It's frozen.
It's frozen.
We could hear you, but we can't see you.
Must be an internet problem. Yeah, the visual is very important. Let me just exit here. Do you still have a video image?
Yes, we do. Okay. I think it's playing now, is it? Yeah.
You know what I'm going to do, Cecilia?
Yeah, it's playing now.
Let me try. Okay, let me just go to the beginning. So you heard the explanation, right?
Yes, we did.
Okay, we'll try again. If it doesn't work, we'll just have you watch it on your own. Okay. And tell me what she thinks about my words through that. I love to go wandering along the mountain track. And as I go, I love to sing my knapsack on my back. Beldery, Beldera, Beldery, Beldera, Beldery.
Sorry, Dr. Allen is frozen again.
Okay. Well, you know what? You have the slide. Let's just move on because we've spent enough time on this. It's just a humorous way of looking at this, and the YouTube link is on the slide, and we can make sure that you all have a PDF copy of the slides. Let's stop share, and I'll get the other one back.
We had copied the link in the chat box, so they can actually link at the chat box for the Happy Wanderer YouTube. Is in the link is in the chat box.
Good.
You can actually access to it. Yeah.
That sounds great. Thanks. Let me get back to my Zoom. Get back to my other screen. All right. Sorry about that. Back to the slides. We'll move on because I want to be sure we have some time for discussion as well. So I believe the last words are that I believe antipsychotics are largely ineffective and potentially dangerous. I think what we see is sedation. And even though the drug studies originally said that they were ruling out sedation in their statistical analysis, the truth is that that sedation in most of those classic studies was measured by self-report in people with very severe dementia. So it was not very well measured. And we have also found in people who have stopped antipsychotics that even in people who are not visibly sedated, they are able to start thinking and doing things without the medications that we didn't think they were capable of doing. So we know that there are some sedating brain effects that aren't always even observable. I don't think there's a lot of biochemical rationale for using antipsychotics, but I've never thought that they were the root problem. They're a symptom of something else, and that is the notion that that people who are distressed need a pill. So I'm going to move now over to what we can do differently. But first, let's get back to the idea about the non-pharmacological interventions. This was my struggle, because when I tried to avoid pills, I would come up with a list of things to try, and they never seemed to work for me either. And I was back wondering about pills again. But I heard a story, which I'll tell you quickly, which really changed my mindset. I was in Iowa, a state, a very rural state of the United States. And I heard about a gentleman who moved into a care home, and he had Alzheimer's and had trouble verbalizing. And right from the first day, he kept trying to go out the back door next to the lounge and get into the backyard of the care home. And people would try to redirect them. They'd try different non-pharmacological approaches, but the more they did, excuse me, the more insistent he became. So after several hours of struggling with him, finally the manager said, "We have a fence back there. It's a nice day out. The weather's good. Why don't you let him go and see what he's doing?" So they let him walk out the door, and he went back to a fence at the back of the yard, and there was a pasture with cattle, with cows in it. And he watched the cows for about 15 minutes, and then he turned around and came inside and was very calm. And when they met with his family later, the family said, well, he had been a farmer, and he probably saw the cows out the window and felt the need to check on the herd of cows, just as he would have done as a farmer. Now, the reason I tell that story is not just because somebody cleverly figured something out, but this is what happens with non-pharmacological approaches. What we tell people to do is try hand massage, or try aromatherapy, or try personalized music. And they may seem good, but if the person wants to check on cows, none of those things are going to work any better than pills either. So unfortunately, even our attempts to use non-pharmacological approaches is still using that biomedical mindset. We're reactive instead of proactive. The activities often do not have underlying meaning or address the root cause. They're not tied into the person's individual well-being. And we even treat them like doses of pills. We can either give pills scheduled, or we can give them as needed. And we do the same thing with our non-pharmacological approaches. We either do them scheduled, like full washcloths once a day, or we do them as needed. When a person gets upset, try a hand massage. And we superimpose them upon the usual care environment without really addressing what the true root causes are. And so it's not that we shouldn't avoid pills, it's that we're going about it, I think, the wrong way. So I ask people, how would you think differently? If you're taught what everybody says, including the media, that over 90% of people living with dementia will have a BPSD during the course of their illness, what does that make you think about the cause of the problem, what's at fault, and how useful a pill is going to be? And how would you view those questions instead, if instead we taught that over 90% of the people living with dementia will find themselves in a situation in which their well-being is not adequately supported? Now, where is the problem? And now, how useful is a pill? It's the same person. We're just looking at the situation in a different way. And that's using those different eyes. So my approach has three basic pillars. First of all, redefining dementia, not so narrowly as just biomedical disease. Using well-being as my primary outcome. And I'm going to share one framework that I use. And the third part is transforming the supportive care environment, because neither a nice mindset or a nice goal will work if you still work within care systems that reinforce old ways of thinking and acting. It's very hard to act differently in a rigid system that doesn't want you to act differently. So you have to educate along with transforming systems if you really want to get somewhere. So one of the first things I did in trying to figure out my first book was, how do I define dementia in a way that's not overly medicalized, not judgmental, and just explains in the most neutral ways possible what is happening to a person with dementia. And what I came up with is this definition. Dementia is a shift in the way people experience the world around them. That's all. We're not perceiving the world the way we used to. And it may be imprecise, but I think it does certainly apply to what is going on in a general way. I have changed and evolved a lot of my thinking over the past 15 years. This is the one thing that I have not changed in all that time. This has led me down a very different road, thinking of dementia this way. And here are some of the things that happen. First of all, I see people through more of a different ability or a disability model, which a lot of people are talking about these days. One of my greatest teachers was the late Dr. Richard Taylor, who lived with Alzheimer's for 15 years and traveled and gave talks. We traveled together. We made presentations and videos together, and he taught me a lot about dementia. And the first time I met him, actually in Singapore at Alzheimer's Disease International, back 14 years ago, he said in his keynote, "I am not dying of a fatal disease. I'm living with a chronic disability." So that changed my focus from dying to living, from disease to disability. And when I think about disabilities, I think about ramps for people in wheelchairs. We don't ask a person in a wheelchair to walk upstairs, we give them a ramp. But the truth is, we're not giving ramps to people with dementia. And I'm talking not about wheelchair ramps, but brain ramps, cognitive ramps, because people with dementia have changing abilities too. They're seeing the world differently, and they have different abilities in their cognitive function. And yet, instead of accommodating those the way we would accommodate a physical disability, we expect people to live in environments based on our view of the world, our rhythms, our schedules, our staffing needs. And when people can't and become distressed, we medicate them. And that's really not much different than giving an antipsychotic to a man who's upset because you tried to make him walk upstairs when he was in a wheelchair. This really led me to see that people can continue to grow and that there's sort of a new normal for people and that there are universal human needs that we can fulfill today, even without a new pill. And it led me, as you can see, to challenge many of our long accepted ideas. It also changed expertise because when you think about dementia through neuropathology, then the brain is so complex that the only experts are the neurologists and the doctors, the specialist doctors. So if somebody wants to, if somebody's upset because the person they're caring for doesn't want to take a shower, what do we often do? We pick up the phone and we call the doctor. Well, I can tell you, and when I went to medical school, no one taught me how to give somebody a shower. What they taught me to do was to give pills. So if you call me, that's the kind of thing you're going to get from a doctor. But when you define dementia by experience, then the person with dementia and those closest to that person become the experts because they know the person best and can understand that changing experience and look through the person's eyes. So now the people who are providing hands-on direct care are given the power to find solutions just by being guided in thinking about this differently. And that's what I do, the consulting I did today. I didn't solve anybody's problems. I gave the team a different way to think about the person that they know, and that way they can come up with new solutions. I have 3 charts here. I think what I'm going to do in the interest of time, they're in my first book. They compare the biomedical view with my view, and they will be in the PDF handout. But I'm going to move beyond those just to talk about my approach a bit so we can leave some time before people may need to go on to their work. Why use a well-being approach? The second pillar was to focus on well-being. Well, first of all, well-being needs are universal. We all need well-being, regardless of our age, culture, ethnicity, nationality, faith, tradition, or whether we have an illness or not. And people who are chronically ill or have dementia have more trouble maintaining their own well-being without assistance. But we do not teach about well-being in our traditional carer or medical or nursing education. And therefore, we're often unaware of the need to support these very important human needs. And furthermore, many of our daily operations will actually erode people's well-being, will actually reduce their ability to have well-being because of our inflexible or our underestimating and restrictive systems of care. So therefore, I believe much of the stress we see among people that we have not solved is not from brain disease, but the root cause, the deeper cause, is that these various aspects of well-being are not fulfilled. And this can happen anywhere, not just in residential care, because no one's taught about how to support well-being and supporting people with dementia. So the punchline to all this is, what if those people that you just can't solve or figure out are actually distressed because of erosion of one or more aspects of their well-being? If it's such a universal need and there's no training to teach us about it, then it shouldn't surprise us that people we care for continue to have distress, even though we have done everything we've been taught to try and solve it. So this is the framework I used. It was from a white paper by the Eden Alternative. The commissioned 10 people who are specialists in geriatrics to think about what human needs are universal, and particularly in caring for older people. And they came up with these 7 domains of well-being: identity, connectedness, security, autonomy, meaning, growth, and joy. They had them in a somewhat different order, but when I saw them, I decided with my second book that I would spend that book taking these 7 domains and looking at dementia through the lens of these 7 domains of well-being. What do they mean? How are they challenged by dementia? How are they challenged by care systems? And how can we start to restore them in people who have lost much of this well-being? So where can we talk about well-being? Well, anywhere. When somebody moves into residential care at a routine care plan, the place where I'm using it is at care conferences due to distress and in daily shift huddles, but they can be used in a dementia-friendly or age-friendly community for anyone who is trying to understand a person in distress. The advantages of well-being is it's proactive and strength-based. Most of what we're taught to do when someone gets upset is reactive and deficit-based, and that's why it may calm for the moment, but never solves the problem. And the other nice thing about looking at well-being, because they're so universal, you don't have to know all the details about a person's neuropathology or their stage in order to come up with a very useful response. But the biggest thing is nothing cures dementia, and this doesn't cure dementia either. But it's difficult to live, particularly in residential care, with a diagnosis of dementia. And what this does is it provides more resilience and reserve for people who are in challenging situations when you strengthen their well-being. So I compare it to turning down the heat on a tea kettle. If you are boiling water for tea, when it gets to a certain point, the water boils and the steam erupts. And many people who are reacting in care settings are people that don't have any well-being, and so they're like a kettle on the boil all the time. And it can take the slightest thing to get people into a crisis situation. When you start filling those well-being domains, what you do is you turn down the heat. You don't cure their dementia or make their living environment that much easier, but you give them more reserve so that they don't get pushed to the point where they have such catastrophic reactions. A well-being approach is not just reacting in the moment. You may have to do that in the moment, but that's not the solution. It is a series of supports that have to be implemented around the clock by the entire care team. You're building an infrastructure and an environment supportive of those well-being domains. Now, there are other good well-being frameworks, the Census framework from Nolan and Keating, Tom Kibwood's well-being models, Manfred Max Neef. You don't have to use mine. I just had to have one that I like, that I teach from. So I use that for my talk. But if you use it the way I use it, any well-being framework can be successful. So what I do in a case conference is when we hear about somebody's challenges and their distress, what I do is I have people look at 7 glasses, and it's very helpful. We found that today people were so struck by the visual image of drawing 7 drinking glasses on a piece of paper. And when you hear about the person, then trying to look through that person's eyes, take what you know from talking to the person and saying, how full are those glasses for this person right now? Imagine being that person. So how much do I have a sense of identity, of connectedness, of security, of autonomy, of meaning, of growth, or of joy? And you can get people to very quickly come to a consensus. Is that glass 30% full, 70% full, 10% full? And this is the amazing thing. And this is the first part of the exercise. I have done this in over a dozen countries on 5 continents with very smart, very talented and creative residential care workers who are struggling with somebody when they bring a real life case to me. And we go through the history and then we have them do these 7 glasses. And what I've found is it's very rare to find more than one glass that's more than 30% full, and most of them are nearly empty. So I can stop right there and I can say, you have been doing everything you've been taught to help this person's distress, and look at these 7 areas of human need that are almost completely ignored. Now, why are we surprised that this person hasn't gotten better? And that's when the real light bulb goes on and people see what's been missing in our approach to care. Now, the next half of that, this is the hard part, because we have to do something counterintuitive to what we've been taught to do. And that is stop trying to fix the behavior and instead just fill those glasses. Don't just do it when a person's having a bad time. Do it on good days. Do it 24/7, every team member. When you identify an empty glass, maybe the autonomy glass is very empty, choice and control. Think of all the little ways throughout the day and night when you can give the person more choice and control in every interaction. And they're small things, they're not big things, and they don't seem very consequential. But when you do this in the background, they add up over time and they start to create a different experience for the person. And sometimes without even addressing the person's behavior directly, you start to see it melt away and stop happening because you've actually gotten to the root cause. It's a little hard to believe, but it's amazing how much success we've had. We have not had a formal prospective study. This is what I'm embarking on now, but I do have a colleague who's been working with this extensively for the past few years. I'm going to share some of her information with you. Her name is Dr. Angela Norman. She's a doctor of nursing practice in the state of Arkansas. And she came to me after my second book came out, and my second book explains this process. And she said, I want to try this down in Arkansas with my consulting group. And she started with a couple of small pilots that were highly successful. And so over the years, she expanded that. So for about the past 5 years now, through the pandemic, she has been using this well-being approach that she has adapted. And she has got a consulting group that goes into a care home, teaches about the well-being approach, coaches them, and they have a hotline people can call when they get in trouble. And they've been doing this now for 5 to 6 years. And I want to tell you that they are working currently with 92 residential care homes across the state. So these care homes belong to different organizations. They're not all owned by the same people. They cover a large area of the state. And those 92 homes represent 41% of all residential care homes in the state of Arkansas. So this is not one nursing home doing something super. She has brought this approach to 92. And she, within 2 years, before the pandemic started, she got those antipsychotics in 92 homes to an average of 6.5% across 92 care homes. And they did not increase during the pandemic. She also found that acute discharges to emergency or geri psych units in 1 year was cut by 74% by using this approach. So this is, and we're going to work with a researcher to go back retrospectively and try to capture some of her success, because she didn't set this up as a prospective trial, but obviously this is pretty striking. I've never heard of any intervention in the world that could get this kind of result across nearly 100 residential care homes from different providers. So this is not semantics, because the National Institute of Aging in the US several years ago started an $11 million grant to 5 major centers, and they're giving electroconvulsive therapy to people who have, quote, severe BPSD. So in other words, they're actually giving electroconvulsive therapy, which is controversial enough when people have brain damage, pre-existing dementia. The safety, long-term safety and effectiveness is very controversial. But these subjects were enrolled because they were sent to geri psych units because of BPSD. But what if those people had lived in those 92 homes in Arkansas? They never would have been in the study. They never would have gotten electroconvulsive therapy, because they would have had their distress well addressed without antipsychotic drugs. They would have stayed in their nursing homes and never been to a place where they would have been enrolled in such an invasive and potentially dangerous study. So this slight definition of how I see distress differently can lead to very, very different outcomes where human health and human lives can be at stake. So I'm going to stop the formal comments with a quote by my good friend, the late Richard Taylor. I asked him several months before he died what his main message was. And he said, we need to see the humanness in people with dementia. And then he said something remarkable. He said, I believe that as people progress with dementia, their humanity increases. And I think what Richard was saying was that we have a lot of social roles, we have filters, we have things that we kind of put to the side, like I may put something to the side, like someone was trying to call me on the phone while I was talking to you. We can do that. When a person is unable to maintain all those pretenses and those societal roles, what emerges is actually more their raw humanity. The person's not going away. The person is actually in many ways revealing themselves. And he said we have to be able to understand and accept and support that reality when it occurs. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've probably run up to the hour, but I don't have to go anywhere. So I am happy to hear any comments or questions that anyone can stay on for. But I still see 300 people, so I am very humbled by that. I thank you all for being here and listening to me, and I'm happy to hear what anyone has to say or any questions you might have.